Chinese, Mandarin, Modern Standard Mandarin, Standard Chinese, Pǔtōnghuà, Guóyǔ, Hànyǔ, Zhōngwén, Huáyǔ. In modern times, there are so many different ways of explaining or describing the Chinese language. And in today's video, we are going to look at the many different names of the Chinese language. We are going to go through each of them one by one. And to introduce today's subject, we'll start with the podcast, the China podcast with James and Jessica. They will explain to us a little bit about how these different names come about. And then I will come back and we'll go through one by one those modern names for the Chinese language. And by the way, I want to say something about James, Jessica, and myself. We have one thing in common. James, Jessica, and myself, although we covered so much about the Chinese language, we don't speak Mandarin. I don't speak Mandarin. Yes, I do a lot of research into the Mandarin language as well as Chinese and so on, but actually I don't speak Mandarin. Mandarin is not a subject which I learned in school, and so I need to beg your forgiveness if my pronunciation of some of the words in Mandarin is a little bit off, because I don't speak the language, but I will do my best to pronounce it as accurately as possible. What I do have is knowledge about the Chinese language. Many of you out there may be fluent in speaking Mandarin, but you might not know about the Chinese language. So we are in a trading position. You'll listen to what I have, what I can share with you about the language, while you yourself are a person who can speak the language properly and fluently. And so without further ado, let's all start with James and Jessica at the China podcast.
All right, let's dive into this linguistic rabbit hole here with what we call the Chinese language. We're going to be tackling the many names of the Chinese language.
The many names.
And we all know terms like Mandarin and Chinese.
Right.
But trust me, there is a whole lot more to the story here.
Oh, yeah.
We're going to be uncovering what these different names reveal about history and culture and even the political landscape. And just to pique your curiosity, did you know that Mandarin actually has roots in Portuguese?
It's true.
Yeah.
It's fascinating how such a simple question, right? What do we call this language? Opens up such a complex world.
Yeah.
And it really highlights the fact that language is never just about words.
Okay, so we're not just talking about, regional dialects here. Like this goes way beyond just accents and a few different words, right?
You got it. We're talking about Hànyǔ, which translates to the language of the Han people. And it acts as this huge umbrella covering a massive range of spoken varieties. And then within that, we have the standardized forms like Pǔtōnghuà used in mainland China. Each name tells a story, reflecting different historical periods and even political ideologies.
Okay, so let's start with the term most of us are familiar with, Mandarin. It's so common in English, but you mentioned it has a Portuguese connection. That's not what I expected at all.
Right. It's a bit of a linguistic twist. The story goes back to the 16th century when Europeans first made contact with China. They observed these court officials using a specific language. And the Portuguese, they called these officials Mandarins. And over time, the term was applied to the language itself.
Hold on. So Mandarin was initially about the people, not the language.
That's right.
That's an interesting evolution.
Exactly. And to add another layer, the Chinese themselves didn't even use this term. It was an outsider's label applied by the Portuguese that eventually became the standard English term. For the language those Ming and Qing dynasty officials spoke, it slowly morphed to encompass those northern dialects that ultimately shaped what we now know as Standard Mandarin.
So we've got this name that originates from outside observers, and it ends up becoming the common global term. That's a pretty powerful example of how cultural interactions can shape language. But then what about Guóyǔ? I know I've heard that term before, usually in the context of Taiwan.
That's a great point. And it brings us into the 20th century, the era of the Republic of China. Guóyǔ, meaning national language, emerged then with this strong emphasis on, national identity. It was promoted as the language of the nation, largely based on those same northern Mandarin dialects that gave rise to Mandarin. And you're right, it's still very much in use in Taiwan and even some Southeast Asian Chinese communities to this day.
So it's almost like Guóyǔ carries this extra weight of nationhood and cultural identity. Is that a fair way to put it?
Absolutely. And then we move into mainland China under the People's Republic. And in 1955, we get the official adoption of Pǔtōnghuà, common speech. Now, with this term, we see a different focus. The idea of unifying all the diverse ethnic groups within China under a single language.
So from outsider label to national identity to this concept of unity, we're seeing some pretty major shifts in how the language is being framed, all reflected in these different names. This is giving me a whole new perspective on something I thought I understood.
Yeah. It really does. It's really fascinating.
This is great. I love it.
Yeah.
All right, let's take a quick break and we'll come back and continue this deep dive in just a minute.
It really underscores how language intertwines with politics and national agendas. And speaking of unity, that brings us to Zhōngwén, which literally means Chinese writing.
Okay, so we're shifting gears a bit here, but it makes sense, right? If you're aiming for unity across a vast country with so many different spoken varieties, a shared written language would be pretty essential.
Exactly. And Zhōngwén really emphasizes just how crucial the written language has been throughout Chinese history. It goes beyond just a way to write down spoken words. For centuries, people across China could communicate through writing, even if they couldn't understand each other's dialects. It was a powerful force for cultural cohesion.
That's incredible when you think about it. It's like this secret code binding a whole civilization together. But does that mean that Zhōngwén downplays the spoken language in some way?
That's a really interesting question. And it gets to the heart of some ongoing linguistic debates. While Zhōngwén certainly emphasizes the historical and cultural importance of the written form, it doesn't negate the significance of the spoken varieties. Think of it more as highlighting the enduring power of a shared script that transcended regional differences.
So two sides of the same coin. That makes sense. But you mentioned earlier that Huáyǔ comes into play, especially in Southeast Asia. How does that term fit into this whole puzzle?
Huáyǔ adds another layer of complexity, and it really reflects the diversity of the Chinese diaspora. It translates to language of the Hua people. And in Southeast Asia, it serves a specific purpose, to distinguish Mandarin from other Chinese dialects like Cantonese, Hokkien, and Teochew, which are widely spoken in those communities.
So it's almost like Huáyǔ carves out a space for Mandarin while acknowledging the presence of other Chinese languages in the region.
Precisely. It reflects a kind of linguistic balancing act. On one hand, there's the recognition of Mandarin as a standard or official language, often associated with China itself. But at the same time, Huáyǔ acknowledges that the linguistic landscape is much richer and includes these other Chinese varieties that are deeply ingrained in Southeast Asian culture and identity.
This is getting really fascinating. It seems every term we unpack reveals another layer of history, culture, and even identity politics. Before we started this deep dive, I honestly thought I had a decent grasp on the Chinese language, but clearly there's so much more to it than meets the eye.
I think that's a common experience. Language can be deceptively complex, and the Chinese language, with its long history and global reach, is a prime example of that.
You're telling me. It makes me wonder if all languages have these kinds of hidden stories and shifting meanings behind their names. It seems like we often take language for granted, but there's a whole world of history and culture woven into every word.
Absolutely. Language is constantly evolving, and each name, each term, tells a story. And sometimes understanding those stories can give us a much deeper understanding of a culture, a people, and even ourselves.
Okay, so we've explored Mandarin, Guóyǔ, Pǔtōnghuà, Zhōngwén, and Huáyǔ. That's quite a journey already. But I have a feeling this isn't the end of the story. What other linguistic gems are waiting to be uncovered?
Well, while those are some of the most common and impactful names, we really just scratched the surface. The beauty of language is that there's always more to discover, more layers to peel back.
I'm definitely intrigued. Let's dive deeper and see what other linguistic treasures we can unearth. I'm ready for more. So we've uncovered all these layers of meaning behind the names for the Chinese language, and it's clear that it's so much more than just a way to communicate. It's intertwined with history and culture and politics and even identity. What's the key takeaway here for our listeners? What's the one thing they should really remember from this deep dive?
I think the most important thing to remember is that the language we often simply call Chinese is far more intricate and nuanced than it might appear. Each name we've discussed, Mandarin, Guóyǔ, Pǔtōnghuà, Zhōngwén, Huáyǔ, reveals a different facet of that complexity, reflecting different historical periods, cultural perspectives, and even political goals.
So it's about acknowledging that language isn't static, right? It's constantly evolving and adapting to the world around it.
Exactly. And these various names for the Chinese language are a perfect illustration of that. They offer a glimpse into the dynamic relationship between language, culture, and identity, showing us how these forces interact and shape our understanding of the world.
You know, it's funny. Before this deep dive, I felt like I had a pretty good grasp on the Chinese language, but now I realize I was just scratching the surface. It's made me think about all the other languages out there and the stories they must hold within their names and evolution. Is this kind of linguistic evolution unique to Chinese? Or do all languages go through these kinds of shifts as cultures and politics change?
That's a great question. And the answer is a resounding yes. Every language, no matter how big or small, carries within it a rich history of cultural interactions, power dynamics, and social change. The way we name and talk about languages is constantly evolving, just like the languages themselves.
Wow, you've given me a lot to think about. I'm already starting to see the languages I'm familiar with in a whole new light. Before we wrap up, is there a final thought you'd like to leave our listener with? Something to really spark their curiosity and keep them exploring this fascinating topic.
I'd like to challenge our listeners to consider this. How do these different names for the Chinese language reflect broader cultural and political dynamics, not just within China, but on a global scale? How do these names shape our perceptions of China and its place in the world? How do they influence the interactions between different cultures and linguistic communities?
Those are some great questions. It really highlights the power of language and how it extends far beyond simple communication. It shapes our understanding of the world, influences our relationships with other cultures, and ultimately plays a role in shaping who we are.
Precisely. Language can be a bridge between people, but it can also be a source of misunderstanding and even conflict. The key is to approach language with curiosity, open-mindedness, and a willingness to learn and explore.
Well, I can confidently say this deep dive has been a real eye-opener. I feel like I've gained a whole new appreciation for the Chinese language and its many names. But more importantly, it sparked a new fascination with language in general. Thank you so much for sharing your insights and taking us on this incredible linguistic journey.
The pleasure was all mine. Keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep into the fascinating world of language. You never know what amazing discoveries await.
Having heard from James and Jessica on the many names for the Chinese language, now let's go through each of the names of the Chinese language one by one, and we'll explore how each of those names come about. Okay, the first one. The first word we are going to look at is the word Chinese itself. And the word Chinese came from, of course, the word China. While China itself is derived from the word for the Qing dynasty, the Chinese dynasty from 221 BC to 206 BC. And this Qing dynasty is the one credited for having unified much of China and was the first of the many names for China that is exposed to early travelers. The name China or Qin first appeared in Sanskrit as China in the 5th century BC. And then by the early part of AD, the word appears in Persian as Jin. And from Jin, the word spread on to Arabic as Al-Sin. Al-Sin in Arabic. Then it continues on to European languages. The word Chinese or China and Chinois in French first appeared in European languages in the 16th century. And by the late 16th century, the word Chinese has appeared in English. And so that is the etymology of the word Chinese. And Chinese itself is a very general term for all things Chinese. So that's how the word Chinese came about. The second word we are going to look at is Sino. S-I-N-O, pronounced Sino. Sino also comes from the Qing dynasty, but this one comes via Latin. And it has been used as early as the 2nd century AD by Greek and Roman writers such as Claudius Ptolemy. He mentioned Sino. And from this word Sino, we get the adjective Sinitic, as in Sinitic languages. We are going to explore Sinitic languages in their own video in future. I have to say there's so much to know about China, Chinese and Chinese languages that I have to segregate them into different videos. So you bear with me. In this video, we are just going through vocabulary of different names for Chinese languages. So now it's Sino, is also from Qing dynasty, and it's coming to the modern English via Latin. By now, you may have noticed the word Chinese, Sino. They are words that are used by outsiders to describe the Chinese people. The Chinese themselves don't call themselves Chinese. Yeah, it doesn't appear in their languages. And we are going to look at the words that they use to describe themselves. But first, we look at the words that we use to describe them. And the next one is Mandarin. And when you hear from James and Jessica just now, you would hear that Mandarin actually came from the Portuguese. And the Portuguese used the name Mandarin to describe the bureaucrats, those people who speak what we also call as the Beijing dialect. And because they are who they are the bureaucrats, the Portuguese describe the bureaucrats in the Portuguese word Mandarin, which becomes Mandarin. And from there, we also get the word for in Malay like menteri. The word menteri is also has its cognate or roots from there, and from there it goes back again to English, the words such as minister. So all these words have relationship one to the other. The word Mandarin itself doesn't come from Mandarin language itself. The word Mandarin comes from Portuguese. The next word we are going to learn is Beijing dialect. What is the Beijing dialect? Beijing dialect is the language spoken by the Mandarin. That is to say, the bureaucrats in the time of old, before modern standard Mandarin, they speak Beijing dialect. But Beijing dialect is the language from which we get modern standard Mandarin. So when the early traders, European traders, Arab traders, Persian traders, Indian traders interacted with the seafaring merchants, and sometimes they interacted with the bureaucrats that came all the way from Beijing, they hear that the Mandarin speak a Chinese dialect, and that dialect is called the Beijing dialect. And if I were to give a detour from there, the Hokkien language is actually the Quanzhou dialect, the Zhangzhou dialect, and the Xiamen dialect. But the seafaring merchants, instead of saying that we speak the Zhangzhou dialect, we speak the Quanzhou dialect, we speak the Xiamen dialect, they straight away say that we are from Hokkien province and we speak Hokkien. And so the language spoken by the seafaring traders of Zhangzhou, Xiamen, and Quanzhou become known as Hokkien. Even though, to be exact, the Hokkien province has more than the languages of Zhangzhou, Quanzhou, and Xiamen. There is also the Fuzhou dialect. There is also the Hakka dialect spoken in Fujian province. So in a way, it's just like instead of saying the bureaucrats, instead of saying that I come from Beijing and I speak Beijing dialect, the bureaucrats says I speak Chinese and I come from China. So as a result, instead of saying Beijing dialect, they say Chinese. So Chinese, it becomes the byword for the Beijing dialect. Anyway, what I'm explaining here is that Beijing dialect is the dialect from which you get modern standard Mandarin before we have modern standard Mandarin. The next one is modern standard Mandarin. So what is modern standard Mandarin? Modern standard Mandarin is taking the Beijing dialect and then giving it a written system, a writing system for Beijing dialect, and then popularizing it throughout China. So Beijing dialect otherwise is a vernacular language spoken by the people in Beijing. So it is one of many Mandarin languages. In China, there is the Beijing dialect and also other dialects of Mandarin. The same as Hokkien itself has many dialects such as the Zhangzhou dialect, the Quanzhou dialect, and the Xiamen dialect, which is a fusion of the Zhangzhou and Quanzhou dialect. So Hokkien itself has many different dialects. So too is the Mandarin languages. It is spoken in a very widespread area of China, all over different parts of China, but they are all speaking different dialects of Mandarin, and the one spoken in Beijing is the Beijing dialect. And in our next video, we are going to go into detail of how they use the Beijing dialect and turn it into modern standard Mandarin. But for now, let's just understand that modern standard Mandarin is the standard Chinese language that is derived from Beijing dialect. The next one is Standard Mandarin Chinese. Standard Mandarin Chinese is the official language of China. There's no difference between modern standard Mandarin and standard Mandarin Chinese. They are one and the same, but you will hear them being used interchangeably. So it can be modern standard Mandarin or standard Mandarin Chinese, one and the same in a way. Next is Standard Chinese. So the word Standard Chinese is the common way in English to describe Pǔtōnghuà. We are going to touch on Pǔtōnghuà later. So when you hear Standard Chinese, once again is the standard language that is used in China. And in China, Standard Chinese is regarded as the official language, that is to say almost interchangeably with modern standard Mandarin and standard Mandarin Chinese. So in terms of the socio-political approach of looking at it is one language for China, that is Standard Chinese, and all the other Han Chinese languages are dialects, even though those dialects are also called Sinitic languages. So the way we describe it in English sometimes gets it lost in translation, because at one moment we can say Sinitic languages, and then at another moment we are saying dialect groups, but they are one and the same. Dialect groups and Sinitic languages are the same thing. But Standard Chinese is the other name for Pǔtōnghuà, but in English. The next one is Guóyǔ. Guóyǔ means national language, and for national language, in the beginning, it's not even Mandarin. The term national language was first used by the Qing government, and as you understand, the Qing government was created by the Manchus. So in the very beginning, in the late Qing dynasty, and by the way, Qing dynasty is 1644 to 1912 or so, whereas Qing dynasty, which we spoke about earlier, QIN, is from 221 to 206 BC. So these are two different dynasties. So anyway, in the Qing dynasty, originally it was the Manchus, but over time they begin to accept and adopt Imperial Mandarin as the language of the court. That is to say, the Manchus took over China, and over time they adopted the Mandarin language as their own language and putting aside their own Manchu language. Anyway, Guóyǔ itself in the beginning was Manchu, but eventually Imperial Mandarin, that is to say the Beijing dialect as used at court in Beijing, became the Guóyǔ. And Guóyǔ itself comes from the idea of creating this Guóyǔ comes not from China itself but from Japan. The Qing government learned from the Japanese, because in 1902 the Japanese Diet formed the National Language Research Council, and the National Language Research Council of Japan standardized Japanese language as Gokugo. Gokugo has the same kanji as Guóyǔ. So for a while, Guóyǔ was national language. But later on, by the 1930s, the communists have an issue with the use of the word Guóyǔ, because they are in this ironic or rather strange position where on the one hand, they have no problem in erasing all the other Han languages such as Cantonese, Shanghainese and so on. But on the other hand, they also do not want to appear as though they are coercing minority groups to adopt a national language. And so when I say minority ethnic groups, they are like the Mongolians, Tibetan, Uyghurs, and Zhuang. And if you look at the Chinese banknotes, you will see all the funny writing system, which is in addition to the one for Chinese or Mandarin, because they want to always appear that they are having all of them as one, that these are united, including all those minority ethnic groups. And so on the one hand, they want to have a standardized Chinese language, but on the other hand, they do not want to appear like they are forcing those minorities into the majority language, which is the Han Chinese language or the Guóyǔ. So by the 1930s, the term Guóyǔ is being phased out for the next one. And the next one is Pǔtōnghuà. Pǔtōnghuà means common language. Yeah, the language that is commonly in use. But what is this commonly in use language? In the very beginning, in about 1906, Pǔtōnghuà was used for the first time. I mean, the term Pǔtōnghuà appears for the first time in 1906 or so. And at that time, it is to differentiate between the vernacular spoken language from literary Chinese. In our previous video, we have spoken about literary Chinese, the written language. Now, in 1906 or so, this is when the Chinese begin to realize that they need to phase out literary Chinese and to adopt a common written language, a written language that is also spoken. And so this Pǔtōnghuà means the common written language, and over time the term Pǔtōnghuà phases out the term Guóyǔ. The Chinese government does not feel comfortable to use the term Guóyǔ, but they prefer to use the term Pǔtōnghuà, and Pǔtōnghuà means common language. And this common language also replaces literary Chinese. Literary Chinese is not common language because it is a language for the elites and it is written specifically for communication, whereas Pǔtōnghuà is spoken as well as written. And this is the transition towards modern standard Mandarin. Next is Hànyǔ. Hànyǔ means the language of the Han people. And the Han people is collectively all the different types of Chinese people, be they the Beijing people or the Cantonese or the Shanghainese or the Hokkien or the Teochew and so on. Collectively, these are Han people. So to be precise, technically, Hànyǔ means the collective language of the Chinese people. But over time, Hànyǔ has come to be associated with the Mandarin language. So, for example, right nowadays we talk about Hànyǔ Pinyin. So, Hànyǔ Pinyin is the phonetic writing system to represent the sound of the Mandarin language. So, even though Hànyǔ on its own may mean the language of all the Han people. And by the way, the Chinese does not comprise only the Han people. There are also non-Han people such as the Mongolian, Tibetan, Uyghurs, and so on. But Hànyǔ means the language of the Han people collectively. But over time, now it means the standard Chinese or the Chinese which is Mandarin. Next is Zhōngwén. Zhōngwén now refers to the written form. So, Zhōngwén can be written Chinese or written Chinese language. So, when we hear Zhōngwén, it means the written form, written standard Chinese, written Chinese language. And last but not least is Huáyǔ. Huáyǔ used to mean collectively the Chinese languages. Not just Mandarin, but Cantonese, Hokkien, and so on. These are all Huáyǔ until the mid-1960s. And then over time, from mid-1960s onwards, Huáyǔ transformed to mean only standard Chinese, which is Mandarin. So nowadays, and when we spoke about speaking Huáyǔ, we are talking about speaking in Mandarin, but not so in the past. Before the mid-1960s, Huáyǔ actually means all the collective different Chinese languages, in a way similar to Hànyǔ. So Hànyǔ and Huáyǔ have over time transitioned from all the different Chinese languages or dialects into just standard Chinese, which is Mandarin. So there we have it, the different names for Chinese languages, and you would realize that I did not cover some of them deliberately, because this I may want to cover in their own separate videos as separate topics, such as Old Chinese, Middle Chinese, Classical Chinese, and Literary Chinese. So these are Chinese of the past. The Chinese which I have just covered in this video are the ones from the more recent times, from 1900 onwards. Yes, it may overlap into the earlier part, such as Sino and Sinitic, but by and large, these are the words, the names used in modern times for Chinese languages. And so I hope that you find this enjoyable. And also, if you have any questions or any comments, please feel free to put it in the description so that we can ignite discussions and conversations on Chinese languages. Once again, I have to admit that I don't speak Mandarin, and so if I mispronounce some of the words, do forgive me on that. I will try my best to learn the proper pronunciation. Nevertheless, I always love and am passionate about learning about Chinese languages and researching on its history. And if you are like myself, then subscribe to the Learn Penang Hokkien YouTube channel so that I can bring you some more videos. For your information, in order for me to preserve and modernize the Hokkien language, I have to learn lots of Chinese characters and learn how they come about, and also learn the history of Chinese languages, just for the sake of preserving my mother tongue, which is Penang Hokkien. And I'm glad that after an 11-year journey of research, I have accumulated this body of knowledge which I can now share with you. And so I thank you once again for joining me in this particular video on the different names of Chinese languages, and I look forward to having you again. And until then, 感謝盧姐姐。